In this video, we're discussing actual, budgeted, and normal costing. This continues from prior lessons where we were talking about costing systems. A costing system is about assigning a cost to a cost object. In order to do that, we take direct costs and trace them, and indirect costs are allocated to the cost object. In a prior lesson, we focused on the cost object, and depending on the type of cost object, for example, if we had a distinct or unique product or service, we would use something called job costing. If the business was mass producing the same product or service, or very similar products or services, that would be better suited for process costing. Process costing involves more complexity due to ending and opening inventories and spoilage therein. So we'll leave that to a later video. In this video, we're going to look to the left of the screen and focus on direct and indirect costs. Depending on how much actual versus budgeted data we use, we will either use a system called actual costing, budgeted costing, or normal costing. Let's take a look at all three. Actual costing. For direct costs, you would take the actual rates and multiply them by the actual amount of input. For indirect costs, we would take the actual rates and multiply that by the actual amount of input of the cost allocation base. For budgeted costing, we will take budgeted rates times the budgeted input. And for indirect costs, we will take budgeted rates times the budgeted input. For normal costing, for direct costs, we will take actual rates times actual input. And here's where you have to pay attention. For indirect costs, we take the budgeted rates times the actual amount of input, or you could say the actual quantity that is being used by the cost allocation base. Let's zoom in on actual costing. Let's say we have a business and that business is making a specialized gear component to be used by various other companies. In order to cost this out, we have to trace our direct materials costs, our direct labor costs, and we allocate our manufacturing overhead. Let's say direct materials is $100 per kilogram times 10 kilograms. We could say direct labor is $120 per direct labor hour times 10 direct labor hours. And manufacturing overhead is allocated based on a rate of $1.8 million in manufacturing overhead divided by 10,000 direct labor hours. This is what actually happened for this business. If that's the case, we can cost this as follows. Direct materials will be $100 times 10 kilograms, or $1,000. Direct labor will be $120 per direct labor hour times 10 direct labor hours. That's $1,200. Manufacturing overhead will be $1.8 million divided by the 10,000 direct labor hours that actually happened for the period, multiplied by the 10 direct labor hours used by this particular job for $1,800. That totals $4,000. We can contrast this to budgeted costing. Let's quickly explain why this is even used. Budgeted rates are used to estimate costs for a cost object because it allows managers to plan and allocate resources effectively by estimating future costs. This means budgeted rates provide a consistent basis for decision-making throughout the budgeting period. Budgets can then help establish performance targets and control expenditures by comparing actual cost against the budget. Think of it this way. Let's draw a timeline and we'll divide it in half. We'll allow the left side of the timeline that can represent the current period. The right side of the timeline can represent the next or the following period. Budgeting will happen in the current period, perhaps the latter portion of the current period. That is when the budget is prepared for the following period. Because of that, the numbers will not be perfectly accurate. Management is clearly having to use their best estimate. Let's cost it using budgeted data. Let's say direct materials was budgeted to be $105 per kilogram multiplied by 9 kilograms. That would equal $945. If direct labor was budgeted to be $115 per direct labor hour multiplied by 11 direct labor hours, that would equal $1,265. Manufacturing overhead was budgeted to be $1.925 million divided by an estimated 11,000 direct labor hours multiplied by, again, a budgeted 11 direct labor hours per this job. That would be $1,925 for a total of $4,135 under budgeted costing. Now let's look at normal costing. Normal costing assigns costs to a cost object using actual direct material and direct labor costs and budgeted indirect costs. So that's based on a predetermined overhead rate. It's often allocated using an actual quantity. We'll talk about what that means. Managers use normal costing to smooth out fluctuations in overhead costs and ensure more timely and consistent cost estimates. Let's think about accounting information for a moment. For accounting information to be useful, it must be relevant, meaning it has to be timely. Let's draw a timeline again. We'll divide it in half. The left side can represent the current period, and the right side can represent the following period. Direct cost data is complete during the current period. In other words, during the period, we know what the direct costs are. However, some indirect cost data is not obtained until the beginning of the following period. What do we mean by that? We mean after the period, only then do we get all of our indirect cost data. Like what, you ask? Well, property taxes, electricity, water, maintenance, etc. So what do we do if we want to make a cost estimate during the period to provide a customer a quote, for an example? We utilize normal costing. Let's go through an example. So let's say our direct materials, the actual cost is $100 per kilogram times 10 kilograms. That equals $1,000. The direct labor, the actual cost is still $120 per direct labor hour times 10 direct labor hours. That's $1,200. The manufacturing overhead we have to pay attention to. This will be a blended number. We will take the $1,925,000 of budgeted manufacturing overhead, divide that by the 11,000 budgeted direct labor hours, and multiply that by the 10 actual direct labor hours that this job used. That gives us $1,750 for a normal cost of $3,950. Let's summarize the three different cost systems. Actual costing had direct costs of $1,000 plus $1,200 and indirect costs of $1,800 for a total of $4,000. We would expect budgeted costing to have different direct materials, labor, and indirect costs. And sure enough, that's what happened. $945 of direct materials plus $1,265 of direct labor, plus $1,925 of indirect manufacturing costs or manufacturing overhead equals $4,135. Normal costing, we only expect the indirect cost to be different when compared to actual costs. And that's what happened. We have $1,000 of direct materials plus $1,200 of direct labor plus $1,750 of indirect manufacturing costs or manufacturing overhead for normal costing. This equals $3,950. Let's take a moment to move over to a spreadsheet just in case that helps you understand this better. Here we are taking a look at a spreadsheet. We'll take a look at some data first. The actual overhead was given to us as $1,800,000. The actual rate for direct materials was $100 per kilogram of direct material. The direct labor per hour, the actual amount was $120 per direct labor hour. If we come down to quantity, we were told that the specific job took up 10 kilograms of direct materials, and it happened to take up 10 direct labor hours for that specific job. For the entire period, the actual direct labor hours was 10,000 direct labor hours. We can now calculate the actual costs. Direct materials would be equal to the $100 per kilogram multiplied by the 10 direct material kilograms. That's $1,000. If we were to take direct labor of $120 per hour and multiply that by the 10 direct labor hours on the job, we would get $1,200. And then we have to calculate the manufacturing overhead. In order to do this, we need a manufacturing overhead rate. We have enough information to calculate that. Remember, for this example, this company was allocating overhead on the basis of direct labor hours because that's something that they measure. So we could take the actual overhead cost of 1.8 million, divide it by the total direct labor hours of 10,000, and we get $180 per hour. So we can now multiply $180 as our manufacturing overhead rate, multiplied by the 10 direct labor hours used by this particular job. We get $1,800 for a total cost of $4,000. Let's move on to the budgeted data. The budgeted manufacturing overhead was given to us as $1,925,000. We were told on a budgeted basis, they budgeted $105 per kilogram of direct material, and they budgeted $115 per direct labor hour. They budgeted 9 kilograms for this particular job. The direct labor hours for this particular job would have been budgeted to be 11 direct labor hours. The total direct labor hours for the entire period was 11,000. Let's go ahead and calculate the total. We could take the direct material of $105 per kilogram and multiply that by 9 kilograms for $945. We could take $115 per direct labor hour and multiply that by 11 direct labor hours. And then we need to calculate a rate in order to allocate overhead. So we can take a look at the budgeted overhead of 1.925 million. And we would divide that by the budgeted direct labor hours of 11,000. We get $175. Now, if we take $175 as our predetermined manufacturing overhead rate and multiply that by the 11 budgeted hours used for this job, we now get $1,925 in manufacturing overhead. And if we total up these amounts, we get $4,135 for budgeted costing. Let's do normal costing. For direct costs, we use the same rates as actual. So $100 per kilogram and $120 per direct labor hour. For our manufacturing overhead, we utilize the budgeted rate or the predetermined manufacturing overhead rate of $175. With respect to quantity, we would use the actual quantities. Let's cost this out. The direct material cost will be equal to the actual direct material cost. The direct labor cost is going to be equal to the actual direct labor cost. And the manufacturing overhead cost is where it gets quite interesting. You must pay attention. We will take the manufacturing overhead rate of $175. Remember, that's the budgeted rate. And we multiply that by the actual direct labor hours on the job, the actual amount of the cost allocation base that's being used to allocate for this company. in this case 10 hours. That's $1,750 for a total of $3,950. And now we can leave Excel and start to wrap things up. Here we are once again, and you can see on the right of the screen, those are the numbers we just calculated: 4,000, 4,135, and 3,950. For a moment here, let's remove the budgeted costing line and let's compare the actual cost of 4,000 to the normal cost that would have been used during the period of 3,950. You can see that the cost of 3,950 is less than the actual cost of 4,000. That means we are underallocated by $50. For an underallocation that is this small, we could probably write off the difference to the cost of goods sold, but we will cover under and over allocations in much more detail in a later lesson. For now, let's go ahead and summarize these again. Actual costing is our actual rates times the actual input all the way through. Budgeted costing is our budgeted rates multiplied by our budgeted inputs for both direct and indirect costs. Normal costing is where you really have to pay attention. For direct costs, we use actual rates and the actual inputs or the actual quantities. For indirect manufacturing costs, we use the budgeted rates and we multiply that by the actual inputs. I hope you found this video helpful. Until next time, I will say thank you for watching and may your journey be joyful.
In the hustle of the factory floor, we measure what's constantly before actual cost, and that's the way we're coding every dollar day by day. Materials used and the labor true, all the overhead that's due. Counting the cost we need to know, actual budgeted to help us grow. Normal costing in between, guiding us through every scene. Looking ahead to what's in store, budgeted costs we can't ignore. Setting plans with estimated rates, mapping out our future gates. Predicting spend to stay on track, adjusting when there's a fallback. Counting the cost we aim to see, budgeted visions of what will be. Normal costing bridges the line, making projections align. Normal costing takes a piece, actual cost with budgeted fees. Applying overhead that's planned, even when the numbers expand. Combining truths with what we plan. Normal costing helps us understand. Smooths the waves of cost surprise, keeps the profits in our eyes. Counting the cost, we're in the flow. Actual figures and what we know. Budgeted dreams of what's ahead. Normal costing keeps us fed. In the end, it's clear to see these costing methods set us free. Actual budgeted, normal too, they're the beats we move into.